Today's programme for government is billed as prioritising future generations, but the decisions made this week by the Scottish Government do exactly the opposite. We cannot take today's programme for government on its own without looking at the context of yesterday's fiscal update. The slashing of public spending, particularly on our journey to net zero, is selling out the future of our young people. The suggestion that we can continue with business as usual to deliver all the same things whilst spending less money is, quite frankly, delusional. Some clarity about what the Scottish Government will not be able to deliver would be welcome. The Scottish Greens support the First Minister's vision to eradicate child poverty, but the shelving of plans to roll out free school meals for all primary school children, as it appears to be set out in today's programme for government, will make that worse, not better. In addition to funding and programmes, ensuring our children have a future worth living, a future full of opportunity and hope, also requires us to make the tough decisions that are now required to prevent catastrophic climate breakdown. You can't grow a green economy without substantial investment, and more of this investment needs to come from the private sector. That's exactly what the ScotWind funding was. This was supposed to be our green sovereign wealth fund, to invest in solutions like the climate and nature emergencies, like community-owned renewables, and training the next generation of engineers. What we saw yesterday was the Scottish Government emptying the pot, spending the last remaining ScotWind funding, whilst slashing net zero investment, and continuing to give handouts to big business. On the planned Climate Change Targets Bill, the Scottish Greens have reluctantly accepted that whilst the 2030 net zero target is now out of reach, it is due to 15 years, during which time governments fixated on targets whilst failing to make the big changes needed to actually drive down emissions. The Scottish Greens can only support a change to climate targets if it is accompanied by a significant ramping up of action, a climate reset, where we finally stop building new roads and new fossil fuel power stations, where we put climate change at the top of the political and public agenda, where we significantly ramp up the decarbonisation of our homes and public buildings. I am also deeply concerned by the failure to include a bill to ban conversion practices in the legislative programme. This bill started out as a petition to this Parliament over 4 years ago from campaigners whose lives had been impacted by the trauma of so-called conversion therapy. The Human Rights and Equalities Committee concluded over 2 years ago that Scotland-specific legislation be brought forward as soon as possible. And while the Scottish Greens would wholly welcome an eventual UK-wide ban, we in Scotland have the mandate to deliver a watertight ban now, which will end this cruel and inhumane torture that is going on behind closed doors in Scotland. The Scottish Government should confirm when they will press the button on this draft legislation, and it must ensure that we have legislation in place before the next election. Now is the time to show boldness, not to cower to the reactionary forces of the right. This is the first programme for government in 4 years, which the Scottish Greens did not co-design. And quite frankly, it shows. Continuing to hand out tax breaks to private companies whilst scrapping free bus travel for asylum seekers is not something the Scottish Greens would ever have agreed to. Emptying out our green sovereign wealth fund whilst cutting overall funding for net zero by £23 million is a betrayal of future generations and abandoning our responsibility to tackle the climate emergency. Shelving vital legislation on equalities and human rights cannot be blamed on budget cuts and can only be put down to cowardice from the SNP government. We have 18 months left of this session of Parliament to build a fairer and greener Scotland, which leaves our society and our planet in a better shape for future generations. The SNP may have given up on that mission, but the Scottish Greens never will.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, I think we've heard a few familiar tunes this afternoon from the Conservatives. The familiar tune that we need to be spending much more on everything but raising much less tax. That's no great surprise there. From the Labour Party, who used to recognise the context of its austerity being imposed by a Tory UK government, now that it's a Labour UK government that's imposing Tory fiscal rules, that context seems a bit less relevant somehow. So their tune might be changing a little, but not necessarily for the better. As for the SNP, the First Minister tells us he wants to govern harder and stronger. I'm not really sure what that means, but I certainly think it shouldn't mean abandoning the most marginalised in our society, and I'm afraid there is starting to be an element of that creeping into the government's programme. Not just some of the recent decisions, such as cutting the provision of free bus travel for asylum seekers, such a small amount of money that policy costs, such a small amount of money but such a massive benefit to the individuals affected. But it's now entirely unclear what the government's position going forward on free school meals is going to be. It would be helpful if the government could respond on that in the closing. There now appear to be threats to water down rent controls. And I'm quite sure that the landlord lobby are working overtime to ensure that profiteering in the private rented sector can continue, but it's essential that the government and the Parliament stands up for tenants' rights if those amendments seek to water it down. I'm pleased that the Creative Scotland cuts have been reversed, but the huge anxiety that's been created during that period was entirely avoidable. And the decision to abandon the commitment to legislate in Scotland on conversion practices, which my colleague referred to. I see that the Equality Network have already responded, saying that the benefits of a Four Nations approach do not make up for the downsides of waiting for a Westminster bill, namely the Scottish Government losing control of the bill's content and timeline. I give way.
Shirley Ann Somerville.
I hope to be able to reassure the member that the Scottish Government continues to work on a Scottish bill on ending conversion practices. We do hope to take it forward on a Four Nations approach, but if that is not possible, the work is continuing, the pace has not changed, and we will continue that work, and I look forward to working with Green colleagues on that.
Patrick Harvey.
I think the Cabinet Secretary as an individual is someone who is fully committed to the principle, but the government needs to be fully committed to the principle and to the reality of introducing that bill here to the Scottish Parliament and letting us legislate on it. I want to move on and talk about some of the other things that aren't in there. The Human Rights Bill isn't in there, and that's also been criticised by some people outside the chamber. It does lose us the opportunity. It loses us the opportunity to legislate for the right to a healthy environment. Perhaps the government decided that legislating for the right to a healthy environment at the same time as raiding the Nature Restoration Fund would have lacked credibility. The Nature Restoration Fund, which I remind Rachel Hamilton, who's such a fan of it, the Greens created that as a result of the Butte House Agreement that I know she's so obsessed with. As for the climate bill, we know that a new climate bill is going to be necessary. It needs to be a moment of radical honesty, of Scotland acknowledging that we are years behind where we should be on emissions reduction because there hasn't been that willingness. At a political level, there hasn't been the political will to change transport policy, the way we heat our buildings, the way we use land and what kind of agriculture we subsidise. So a new bill, if it's going to be tolerable, if it's going to be supportable, has to be in the context of an acceleration of immediate action, not waiting until after carbon budgets are set, after advice has been taken and after a new climate plan has been produced. That would leave paralysis for most of the rest of this parliamentary session, if not longer. So if a new climate change bill is to seek political support from this part of the chamber, it will need to be in the context of a radical acceleration of climate action in the short term. Presiding Officer, in closing, let me just say that there are warning signs since the SNP moved into, by choice, minority government, that they seem determined now to abandon the trust of those Scots who wanted a progressive, equal Scotland, a Scotland that's willing to redistribute wealth in order to tackle austerity and that's willing to invest in bold and urgent climate action. As my colleague Lorna Slater said, there is still 18 months in which to prove those fears wrong and to commit to the bold action that's necessary. If the SNP abandons that project, the Greens certainly won't.